Or think about Shakespeare. Like, I mean, the guy's a legend, right? But his formal education wasn't all that impressive.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, right? Shakespeare, the big man of English, had
Exactly.
to leave school early
Yeah.
because, well, his dad had money problems.
It's kind of wild when you think about all the amazing stuff he wrote. And then you have Ben Jonson, taking that little jab saying Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek.
Right, like, come on, Ben. But it just, I don't know, kind of humanizes him a bit.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so today we're going deep, folks.
Hmm.
Deep into the world of William Shakespeare, and we're going to focus on Macbeth, that dark, twisted
It's a
masterpiece.
good one, a real classic.
So what we're trying to do today is to understand Shakespeare not just as this, like, literary god, but as a man of his time. Like, how did the world he lived in shape his work? And how did Macbeth hit those original audiences right where they lived, culturally?
Absolutely. And to help us unpack all of this, we're turning to the work of Dr. Jasvant Rathord. His insights into Shakespeare and Macbeth are, well, they're pretty amazing.
Yeah. He connects the dots between Shakespeare's life, the whole Elizabethan era, and the stuff in the play that would really resonated with his audience back then.
It's all connected.
So for our listeners, think of this as like a crash course, right? We're going to cut through all the academic jargon, give you the good stuff, the aha moments, so you can really appreciate Shakespeare and Macbeth on a whole other level. No textbooks here, folks, just straight talk.
Straight talk about Shakespeare.
Now, Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in April 1564. His family wasn't, well, they weren't exactly rolling in dough.
Right. Not rich by any means.
His dad was a merchant, and while he owned some property, he also had some pretty serious money problems.
Yeah, he actually ended up in debt, and that's why Shakespeare had to leave school.
And Shakespeare had a bunch of siblings, 2 sisters, 3 brothers, but none of them became, famous or anything.
None of them wrote any famous plays, that's for sure.
Right, but that grammar school education, even though it got cut short, you got to think it had some impact, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it wasn't like he was completely uneducated.
Mm-hmm.
He had that foundation.
Exactly. So maybe Johnson's dig about the small Latin and less Greek, maybe it was more of a, a friendly jab than anything else.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. Shakespeare was a bit of a man of mystery when it comes to his personal life.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot we don't know, but we do know he married Anne Hathaway. She was actually 8 years older than him.
That's right. And there's been a lot of speculation about their marriage. Some people think it was unhappy.
Yeah, and some even point to a line in Twelfth Night as, like, a clue about his own marriage. There's a part where someone says it's better to marry an older man, kind of hinting at his own situation.
Interesting. They had 3 kids, right?
Yeah. Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith.
Yeah.
And then around the age of 21, Shakespeare takes off for London.
London's calling.
Right. There's this story, though we don't know if it's true, about him poaching deer on someone's land and having to skip town.
That's a good story, though.
It is. But whatever the reason, London is where he really finds his calling, becomes an actor.
It all started there, in the theaters of London.
And his first published work, you know what it was.
Wasn't a play, was it?
Nope. It was a poem, Venus and Adonis, published in 1593.
Poetry first, then plays. Interesting.
Right, so by 1594, he's part of the Lord Chamberlain's company, a pretty big deal acting troupe.
A very influential company.
And he wasn't just acting, he was also, quote, remodeling and setting up for the stage sundry old plays.
So he's like adapting and updating existing plays.
Exactly, which means he's learning a ton about, what works on stage, what audiences like, how to tell a story dramatically, all that practical stuff.
Yeah, that kind of experience is invaluable for a playwright.
Totally. Now, from what we know, Shakespeare was a pretty popular guy. People liked him. He got along with his fellow actors.
He wasn't like a recluse or anything. No, he was out there making connections. And he stuck with the Lord Chamberlain's company for a long time, from 1587 to 1611. And during that time, he wrote 37 plays in all of his non-dramatic poetry.
That's a lot of work.
It is. And the company was super successful, too. Shakespeare became a shareholder in the company and in the Globe Theatre.
The Globe Theatre. Imagine being a part owner of that.
It's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah.
And he was smart with his money, too. He bought property in Stratford, including a place called New Place, and his plays started getting published around 1597. So he's becoming a big deal.
His fame is spreading.
No, not everyone was a fan, though. There's this guy, Robert Greene, another playwright, and he basically calls Shakespeare an upstart crow.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's a pretty nasty dig. He accuses Shakespeare of stealing other people's work and acting like he's the only playwright in town.
Sounds like someone was jealous.
Yeah, professional rivalry, right? But then you have Francis Mears, who praises Shakespeare's talent, calling him mellifluous and honey-tongued. He says Shakespeare's great at both tragedies and comedies. So you have these two very different views of Shakespeare emerging.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Now, when it comes to Shakespeare's personal life in London, there's a lot of mystery. We don't have a ton of information. Some people try to read into his sonnets or his plays, looking for clues about his own emotions, but that's all speculation, really.
We just don't know for sure.
We know he went back to Stratford in 1611 and lived with his wife and his daughter, who was married by then. He died in Stratford on his birthday, April 23rd, 1616.
Died on his birthday. How about that?
Yeah, and we don't even know for sure if his wife lived with him the whole time he was in London. There's just not enough evidence to say one way or the other.
So many unanswered questions about Shakespeare's life.
But here's what we do know. His later years in Stratford were pretty good. He was well off and respected. He wasn't that, that image of the starving artist.
Oh, he was a successful businessman, too.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about Shakespeare the man. Now let's shift gears and talk about the world he was writing for, especially around the time Macbeth was first performed.
The context, right. The context is everything.
Absolutely. Now, Shakespeare's plays, they take us all over the place. You've got historical England, ancient Rome, even places like Denmark in Hamlet and Venice and Othello.
He wasn't afraid to experiment with different settings.
No, he wasn't. But here's the thing. Even when the play is set somewhere else, the language, the references, it's all very much rooted in Elizabethan England.
Right. It's all filtered through that Elizabethan lens.
So Macbeth, yeah, it's set in Scotland, but the audience at the Globe, they wouldn't have been too worried about historical accuracy.
They were more interested in the story, the characters, the themes.
Exactly. Now, life in Elizabethan England, especially in the towns, it wasn't always pretty.
No, it was tough for a lot of people. Overcrowded, unsanitary.
Yeah, and then you have the Puritans. They were becoming more and more influential. They had very strict ideas about, morality and entertainment.
They weren't big fans of the theater, to say the least.
Which is interesting because at the same time, you have these pretty brutal forms of entertainment that were hugely popular, like bear baiting.
Bear baiting, yeah, that was something else.
So bear baiting, they'd chain a bear to a post and then set dogs on it.
It was a blood sport. Plain and simple.
It's violent, it's gruesome, but people loved it, even Queen Elizabeth. She even hosted bear baiting events for foreign dignitaries.
Oh, like a national pastime.
It was, and get this, in 1591 they actually banned plays on Thursdays because that was the day for bear baiting.
They didn't want the theater competing with bear baiting.
Exactly. Now, this is important because Shakespeare directly references bear baiting in Macbeth when Macbeth says, "They have tied me to a stake I cannot fly. But bear-like, I must fight the course." The audience, they knew exactly what he was talking about.
They had that visual, that visceral understanding of what it meant to be a bear chained to a stake, fighting for its life.
Right. It wasn't just a metaphor for them. It was a very real and very brutal image.
And speaking of brutal, there was also hunting. Deer hunting was super popular.
Yeah. They used hounds, bows, and arrows, and red deer, which are pretty rare in England now, were all over the place back then.
It was a different time.
And again, Shakespeare uses this in Macbeth. He has a line, to relate the manner, we're on the quarry of these murdered deer to add the death of you.
It's all about evoking those familiar images, those shared experiences.
Exactly. And falconry, too. That was another big one. Hunting with trained hawks.
Very skilled sport.
Yeah. And they had this thing called sealing, which was covering the hawk's eyes with a hood. And Macbeth actually uses that word sealing when he talks about the night covering the day. Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day.
Again, it's that specific language, that connection to a world the audience knew intimately.
It's amazing, right? How these little details can tell us so much about what was going on in people's minds back then. And it's not just hunting and falconry. Shakespeare throws in references to archery, bowls, wrestling, sword fighting, all these everyday activities that his audience would have understood.
It makes the play more relatable, more grounded in their reality.
Now let's talk about something else that was very real for people in Elizabethan England. The supernatural.
Ah, yes. The supernatural. A big part of their worldview.
Huge. They believed in astrology and spirits and fairies and witches, especially in Scotland.
Scotland had a very strong tradition of belief in witches and the supernatural.
And Dr. Rathod points out this interesting difference between the Celtic people of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales and the Saxon English. He says the Celts were more inclined to believe in these things.
More superstitious, maybe?
Maybe, but even in England, belief in the supernatural was very common. And it wasn't just the uneducated folks. Even well-educated people, people in high positions, believed in this stuff.
It was part of the culture.
Totally. And these beliefs, they lasted for a long time, too. There was a witchcraft trial in 1660 where this famous doctor, Sir Thomas Browne, testified that he believed in witches.
Wow.
And in places like the Western Hebrides of Scotland, people believed in second sight, which is like the ability to see the future, especially death.
Spooky stuff.
It is. So when we think about the witches in Macbeth, we have to remember that for the Elizabethan audience, this wasn't just fantasy.
No, it was very real to them.
They believed that witches had power, that they could influence events, that they could cause harm.
And they were afraid of them.
Now, speaking of witches, we can't forget King James I. He was a big believer in witchcraft. He even wrote a book about it called Demonology.
Yeah, King James was obsessed with witches.
He was. He thought they were everywhere. And get this. The book was supposedly inspired by his own experience with witches. He believed they tried to sink his ship on a trip to Denmark.
That's a good story.
It is. And in Demonology, he talks about how there are all these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters running around.
He was not a fan.
And it wasn't just talk. There were actual laws against witchcraft in England. These laws stayed in place until 1736. And if you got convicted of witchcraft, you could be put to death.
So it was serious business.
Very serious. And the typical image of a witch back then was an old, ugly, solitary woman. They believed witches could make you sick, summon demons, even sail across the ocean in a sieve.
They believed witches could do all sorts of crazy things.
And King James, in his book, he talks about how witches could make these little wax or clay figures of their enemies, and then they would burn them, and that would supposedly cause their enemies to get sick or die.
Like a voodoo doll.
Right. Now think about Shakespeare's cauldron scene in Macbeth. The witches, the spells, the whole atmosphere. For the Elizabethan audience, this would have been terrifying.
Oh yeah, that scene would have freaked them out.
Not like today, where we might see witches as, kind of cool or funny. Back then, they were seen as a very real threat.
And they were blamed for all sorts of bad things.
If you got sick, if your crops failed, if there was a storm, people would blame witches.
It was an easy explanation for things they didn't understand.
Dr. Rathod talks about how even Bishop Jewel, a very important religious festa, preached to Queen Elizabeth about the dangers of witches. He said they were multiplying and causing all sorts of trouble.
And Queen Elizabeth herself apparently thought she was bewitched at one point when she had a toothache.
So when Shakespeare put witches in Macbeth, he wasn't just making stuff up. He was tapping into something that was very real and very scary for people at the time.
He was reflecting their fears, their anxieties, their beliefs about the world.
Absolutely. So to sum it all up, Shakespeare, the man, his life, the world he lived in, all of that is woven into the fabric of Macbeth. The play wouldn't be the same without it.
It's all connected.
It is. Now, here's a final thought for you to chew on. If people believed so strongly in witchcraft back then, how do you think that shaped not just their entertainment, but also their politics, their society as a whole? Think about how powerful shared beliefs and fears can be. They can change the course of history. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone, and keep exploring.
There's always more to learn about Shakespeare.